Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church, where we have been drinking from the river of pleasure for 125 years. Guys, it's good to see you here this morning, and have you noticed that the music was a little old-fashioned this morning? Just, a little old-fashioned. And the reason for that is because we are ready to have kind of a big birthday at the end of this month. 100, tell me, how many years? The church's birthday, that's right, 125 years old. My goodness. Who are the people that were here 125 years ago to build this church? If we can just picture this for a minute to get some perspective. Now think about your parents, okay? Now they're pretty old, right? But that doesn't do it. Think about their parents or your grandparents. Are they pretty old? They are still too young to start this church. So we're talking about your grandparents' parents, and their parents, and their parents, and their parents. Yeah, no, that's it. It most definitely is that old. That's how far back it goes. Yeah, and we've had 125 years of cynicism. That's what they really were, that old. But can you imagine what that was like? All they had was an idea. There was no land. There was no building. There was no piano. There was no choir. There was no Sunday school teacher. They just had this idea of building a Unitarian church in Salt Lake City. And how many of you are kind of happy that they had that idea back then? Yeah, sure. Wow, okay, right. It's just remarkable. So all they had to go on was an idea and a dream. And these people were very, very committed to make this dream become a reality. And so over time, this is what we now have. We have land and a church and a piano and a choir and a Sunday school and a whole lot of wonderful things, but we still have a dream. We still have a dream of making this church even richer, a better experience for more and more people as they come into this church. And you know who the carriers of that dream would be? The ones who are going to have to make this church happen big time in the future? You know who those people are? Who? You. That's right, Fred. Right. Okay. So just keep that in mind. So I think, Jonica, you're going to be doing the chalice slide? Jonica, let's go and start the chalice slide. Go ahead. After you, madam.
Symbol of light, symbol of knowledge, symbol of warmth, symbol of freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love.
Wonderful. Jonathan, thank you. Thank you so very, very much. We have a different kind of hymn to start off our service today. The junior choir sang it last week. So many adults loved it, and they asked David, why can't we get to sing something like this? And so David provided the opportunity for us to sing this great piece. Anything you want to add, David?
It's pretty straightforward. The first part, the phrases kind of move by themselves. freely. Holly will kind of help cue you there. And then we get to the chorus. We sing the chorus through twice, kind of slow. And then I go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we sing it really fast. And on the really fast, we straighten out the 8th notes. The 8th notes don't swing, all right? So the choir will help you. Just follow their lead. And the junior choir, these kids know it well as well. All right? Stand up.
So-
and go in the name.
Can I get an amen? Yes. 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 Praise Emerson. That's right. That's what he said. Praise Emerson. The only thing that brings us here is love, because our hearts are broken open, because we love the world, and because we need to be loved, and because love moves us to work for peace and justice. Love calls us into community and reminds us of the history of which we are a part, as well as the legacy that we are creating. We're going to have a little bit more worship whiplash here this morning, because not only will you hear music from the founding year of this congregation, but you'll also hear this morning's prayer, which comes from a book of song and service for Sunday school and home, compiled by the Unitarian Sunday School Society in 1895. So I invite you to allow these words to take you into a place of prayer and meditation, and set aside for a few moments your 21st century twitches, and just recognize that these words came from our forebears and were their effort to tap into that same place. Most merciful Father, Thou hast made the heavens fair above our heads, and the earth beautiful beneath our feet. Thou givest health to our bodies, and fillest our hearts with joy. We thank Thee for the year that is past, for the support of every minute, and the gifts of every day, for all the good we may have done, and the sins we may have resisted, and the temptations we have overcome. We thank Thee for loving parents, wise teachers, and kind friends, and for all who have helped us to lead the good life. We thank Thee for the blessed words and heavenly example of Jesus, for the help of Thy Spirit, and the promises of the gospel. We bless Thee for the memory of the righteous, and especially for those who were dear to us, who lived in faith and departed in peace. Today, as we think of all Thy goodness and Thy great loving kindness, may we resolve to do more for Thee in the year that is before us, obeying Thy commandments, keeping our hearts from evil, and doing good as we have opportunity. May we walk always according to Thy holy will, so that even while here below, heaven shall be opening to us its bliss and glory. Amen.
Sings of
You know, when I am confused and worried about the issues of the day, I turn to Pat Bagley to help me see the light. And when I am confused and weary of the events of yesterday, I turn to Will Bagley to shed some insight. And so, since we are getting prepared for our big anniversary of 125 years, I turn to Will Bagley. Not as much fun as Pat, but certainly gives us a breadth of information of, and I sought this intentionally, not just 1891, which we'll focus on later, but the years, the decades leading up to the founding of our church. So Will Bagley starts his history lesson by saying that when he came into office in March of 1849, President Zachary Taylor had a problem, and the Mormons of Utah were right in the middle of it. The solution to the dilemma led to the creation of a place called Utah. President Taylor's problem was the American Southwest, occupied by conquest in 1846 and purchased from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe of 1848. Ironically, Taylor's brilliant victories in the war with Mexico had been instrumental in winning the vast territory that would ultimately become the states of California, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. That's a lot of land. The issue confronting the American Republic was what to do with this vast territory, and how to do it without tearing the United States apart. The president had to answer what the Mormon emissary to Congress, physician John Bernheisel, called the great and grave question of slavery. Would the new lands be slave or free? For years, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had kept a balance between the interests of the North and the South. But the admission of Texas as a slave state and the creation of a continental nation forever destroyed the old order. For 2 years, Congress had been unable to resolve the question. January 1850, Taylor proposed a remarkable solution. He would admit New Mexico to the Union and admit California and the rest of the new lands as one big state, reaching from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific. In 2 years, the massive state would be divided, giving the Mormon settlers in the Rocky Mountains a state of their own. The people of the new states could then decide the slavery question for themselves. Enter Brigham Young. In the Great Basin, Mormon leader Brigham Young faced problems of his own. A skillful leader, Brigham Young seldom made a political blunder. When he did, the results were spectacular. Few of his governmental miscues, however, matched the scale of the one he made in December 1848, when settlers in the Salt Lake Valley petitioned Congress for a territorial government. Young had been requesting territorial status for the Great Basin settlements since August of 1846. But had he asked for statehood, Congress might have admitted a Mormon state to the Union in 1850. This would have given the Latter-day Saints the ability to elect their own officials and regulate local laws controlling marriage, including practices such as the plurality of wives most Americans call polygamy. Now, while he waited for Congress to make up his mind, Brigham Young established a free and independent government called Deseret in March 1849. Supposedly, Deseret was an ancient word meaning honeybee, whose origins Mormons believed ran back to the building of the Tower of Babel. That same month, 1849, Young was unanimously elected governor by 625 raised hands in a meeting on the future of the temple grounds. Young set about mapping the borders of a nation-state twice the size of Texas, The state of Deseret stretched from its seaport at San Diego to the crest of the Rocky Mountains and from the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming to Arizona's Gila River in the south. It incorporated parts of modern states reaching from Oregon and Idaho to Colorado and New Mexico. Thomas L. Kane, the Mormons' most influential political ally, soon pointed out that territorial status would leave the frontier settlement at the mercy of Congress and its political appointees. The General Assembly of Deseret tried to correct the mistake in July 1849 and sought admission to the Union as a sovereign and independent state. General John Wilson, along with his family and a military escort, arrived in Deseret in August 1849. Wilson came as President Taylor's emissary, carrying with him the president's remarkable proposal to admit most of the New West as a single state. The Mormons found Taylor's proposition to divide the state in two in 1851 especially attractive, since it would give them a free, sovereign, independent state without any further action of Congress. U.S. Army Captain Howard Stansbury complained that General Wilson had come clothed with the authority from the President of the United States to expel the Mormons from the lands they occupied, and that he would do so if he thought proper. President Taylor's growing disenchantment with the Mormons convinced Young he had been betrayed. After the nation's president died in 1850 and was succeeded by Millard Fillmore, the Mormon leaders said, "Taylor was dead and in hell, and I'm glad of it." In gratitude to the man who succeeded Taylor and appointed Brigham Young as their new governor, the Mormons named their new capital Fillmore and the surrounding county Millard after the Unitarian president Millard Fillmore. President Millard Fillmore's politically deft selection of Young as governor had made territorial status easier for the Mormons to accept, but created problems of its own. Appointing Young governor was easy. When it came time to replace him 8 years later, President Buchanan found it necessary to send the U.S. Army in to make sure his decision was accepted by the residents of the territory. Utah would have to wait 46 years to see its statehood star added to the Union. And I want to add, as a postscript, it was only 41 years later that the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City was founded.
Transylvania to
Well, I didn't do the research, but I wonder what the announcements in 1891 would have looked like. Perhaps the Women's Auxiliary, or a temperance society, or a conversation on the issue of statehood or the race issue. I don't know. I can't share. But what I can share are some of the announcements of the life of this congregation now and of how it continues to live into its mission and vision. For those of you I've not yet met, I'm Reverend Matthew Cockrum, a consulting minister here, and along with Tom Goldsmith and you and the leadership of this church, I'm pleased to serve the mission and ministries of this place. A special reminder that a big celebration of this church's 125th will be taking place off-site on February 28th at the Marriott Dance Theater on the University of Utah campus. It will be at 10:30, the downbeat of the music. It will start at 10:30, and there will be this fantastic slideshow that will start at 10:10 with historic images of the founding figures and times of this congregation. So I hope that you can join us. There's going to be some interesting and fun activities for children and youth, and I hope you can make it there. If you show up here for a 9 o'clock service or an 11 o'clock service, it's going to be kind of lonely, and hopefully there won't be any choir. So they'll all be up there, right? You don't want to miss the choir. A couple of other things to draw your attention to in your bulletin. First of all, the first Sunday of the month, there's an information session that I lead. So if you're new to the church and want to learn more about other newcomers in this congregation and Unitarian Universalism, please meet me down by the piano after the service, and I'll walk you upstairs for a special coffee hour. Also, an encouragement to sign up for dinner and dialogues this month around the theme of spiritual journey, trying to engage everyone in this conversation, since that's part of what this place is exploring right now. Many other opportunities of ways in which this congregation is giving life the shape of justice through its Refugee Relocation Committee, recycling, anti-racism, environmental ministries. And now I invite you to give life the shape of generosity and hospitality. As our ushers come forward to receive this morning's offering, please take a moment to introduce yourself to somebody nearby and to greet a new friend. Welcome to First Church.
You know, most people I know register great surprise, if not downright shock, upon learning that this church began its mission of providing liberal religion in Salt Lake City back in 1891. For 125 years, we have served the Salt Lake Valley in many capacities, a safe place for critical thinking, as a liberal haven in a dominant conservative culture, as a thorn in the side of that same dominant conservative culture, and as a midwife helping to birth such progressive institutions in this valley like the National Organization of Women, Planned Parenthood, ACLU, and the Salt Lake Acting Company, whose first rendition of Saturday's Voyeur premiered on stage in Elliott Hall right here. So as I said, we've been a thorn in the side of the Salt Lake establishment for a long time. Now, this current generation of Salt Lake Unitarians has taken some pretty bold measures in manifesting what progressive thinking actually may look like. We are considered leaders in the community in demonstrating a deep, if not profound, commitment to peace, social justice, eco-justice, human rights, gay rights, women's rights, and the right to pursue a religious journey in community with others free from dogma and doctrine, free to practice spirituality without guilt, shame, or fear. But the boldest liberal effort in this valley was building a Unitarian community in the first place, 125 years ago. And if you think people today have little recognition of what Unitarianism is, try going back to 1891, when these liberal pioneers, and I love calling them pioneers, when these liberal pioneers invested their hopes, their ideas, their fantasies, and money to build a long-lasting community where people could draw the fresh breath of liberalism in an otherwise stifling atmosphere shaped by religious ideas that were totally foreign to free-thinking individuals. And I think it's fair to say, and I say this with humility, this is something that we all share in, and that it is with enormous pride that we can say today that we have well honored the hopes and the dreams of our liberal pioneers. We may safely contend that we may have even exceeded some of the expectations when they first drew up the charter for this church on February 24th, 1891. Through the tireless research efforts of Jenny, our church assistant administrator, who not only ransacked the archives that we hold at this church, but worked so closely with the good people at the Marriott Library's special collections that hold most of our old historical records, we've been able, with Jenny's help, to assemble an impressive slideshow depicting major events in our church's history, as well as showing us some absolutely mind-blowing photos of our initial charter members. I got a preview of this, and these pictures are just amazing, and I try to peer into the eyes of our founders, whose photos made them all look rather stern, or at least they were attempting to look stern. Maybe that was the recommended pose at that time. But there were our founding fathers, magnificent attire, often sitting upright on huge wingback chairs, and they seemed to be looking out at us, wondering what the future of this Unitarian experiment might look like once it got off the ground. And I was trying to look into their eyes, discerning what their individual stories were, and it was a fascinating, silent conversation between the two of us. Now, I would guess that the average age, and this is judging by we had probably 14, 15 photos of our founding members, and I would guess their average age was probably around 45, 50, maybe 55. And thus it became easy to speculate that most of our founders were toddlers at the time Brigham Young led the Mormons into this valley in 1847. And by the time the most tragic chapter in American history began, namely the Civil War in 1861, most of our founders were already in their teenage years. So they would have had, our founders would have had a distinct recollection of the devastating results that follows when a house is divided and cannot find enough common ground or reason to compromise, even to avoid bloodshed. None of our founding members was originally from Utah, so they all settled here for various reasons, bringing with them not only their personal histories, but also their experiences of American history that unfolded during those unsettled, difficult, perplexing decades of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. This was all a part of who they were by the time they got here and founded this church. When they organized in 1891, Benjamin Harrison was president, beating the incumbent Democrat Grover Cleveland in the 1888 election. During Harrison's one-term presidency, he imposed historically high protective tariffs. He created the National Forest Service in 1891, and it was his administration that was the first to reach federal spending levels at $1 billion. I'm glad it was a Republican who reached that milestone. He also tried, unsuccessfully, to enforce voting rights for African Americans. But this did not sit well with the American public, who voted Grover Cleveland back into office in 1892. And when you think about it, in some respects, our political landscape today has changed little in the past 125 years. The issues faced then are remarkably similar to the ones that we confront now in 2016. And this is especially true in the continued efforts now in our country to suppress minority voters, and also our current strife over land use issues as acted out in the occupation near Burns, Oregon, at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. I think it's interesting that the National Forest Service Act in 1891 actually withdrew land from public domain, creating what they called forest reserves. And that was all managed by the Department of the Interior. Just amazing. Salt Lake City in 1891 saw evidence of what is still part of the landscape today. I don't know how many of you realize, but the same year that this church was founded, 1891, the angel Moroni was hoisted up on one of the spires of the temple. It was 1891 that ideas were planted to begin the construction of the city-county building. There was a cornerstone laid the next 1892, and the whole thing was done 1894. But the idea of a city council building happened in 1891, and it was actually conceived as, and this isn't my word, this is, when you read some of the historical documents, you'll find that the reason the city-county building was created was as a rival to the temple, a piece of architecture with which the non-Mormons or Gentile population could identify. So here we have this rivalry between the city-county building and the temple, and fast forward to the Winter Olympics in 2002, and remember, one of the controversies was which was going to be the iconic background at the Medals Award Center. Was it going to be the city-county building? Was it going to be the temple? Mayor that time, Rocky Anderson, went to the mat to have the city-county building, but if anybody was tuned in to the Olympics, of course, it was the temple that served as the background. So the rivalry, it seems, still continues. The Alta Club was completed in 1883, so it was before this church was built. Its purpose conceived as a gentleman's social club, but the club at that time was situated on South Temple between Main Street and West Temple. Its current site wasn't completed until 1897. So I imagine many of our forebears and many of us presently walked up those same stairs to socialize in the Alta Club with friends and perhaps an afternoon martini. Internationally, 1891 did not begin well. It had a certain foreboding quality about it when on January 1st, 1891, French troops colonized the Sudan. The land included what today is not only the Sudan, South Sudan, but also the country of Mali. The region of West Africa became Muslim in the 14th century. But religion was never really a factor until the French colonial occupation, which entailed fierce fighting for many years that followed. The Sudan's conflict with the West produced a byproduct which we see and experience so deeply today. In the clash back then, 125 years ago, between cultures and values and lifestyles, many of the slaves in the Sudan, the migrant workers, farmers, and the poor in more of the urban areas, began to embrace Islam. I mean, really, for the first time, they just saw that as a saving grace. They embraced Islam as a powerful force in their attempt to preserve what was theirs, attempt to preserve their culture, their ideas, their principles. The French occupation in 1891 sparked what we today would refer to as Islamization, the shifting of a culture to obtain stronger Muslim identity for which the Muslims were willing to fight to preserve their values and customs and lifestyles. And so we can say if history teaches us anything, is that events don't just happen in isolation as though spontaneously combusting. The European colonization of Africa by Belgium, Germany, England, France actually produced the seeds of future revolution, hostility, and revenge. The long thread of domination by one culture over another never ends well. And so in the span of just 125 years or less, we're reminded of inevitable historic consequences which continue to visit us today. But concentrating exclusively now on just the year 1891, I must say it's been a lot of fun, very, very engaging and enlightening. 1891. It was the year that the erstwhile French stockbroker, Paul Gauguin, left it all behind and ventured to Tahiti to paint on the island paradise of black sand, beaches, and voluptuous women, and we know how they were clad or not. He died just a few years later, but in 1891, my God, that year marked his moment of bliss, which undoubtedly would have sparked the fantasy and conversation among the gentlemen in Salt Lake City. They were probably thinking, well, the Alta Club or Tahiti? The Alta Club or Tahiti? Which one? Well, anyway, I'm glad that they stayed here and eventually built the first Unitarian church. It was in that same year of 1891 that the French government actually annexed Tahiti, which then became their nation's island far away. 1891, Britain linked to the continent by telephone. The first lines of communication went from London to Paris. I cannot fathom what our founders would have thought of today's internet, nor can I imagine how we will be linked and connected to each other 125 years from now. 1891 was also when Thomas Edison patented the motion picture camera. It was the year our Congress created the Court of Appeals, and the Wrigley Company opened in Chicago in 1891. Nebraska, quite radical that time, Nebraska introduced the 8-hour workday. And of course, one of the huge highlights of that memorable year was George Hormel and Company introducing Spam to the palate of American citizens. What a great year that was, Spam. Traveler's checks were introduced in 1891 by American Express. The first gasoline-powered car made its debut in Springfield, Massachusetts. The first electric starter for automobiles was patented. Stanford University opened its doors. The first escalator was patented and installed at Coney Island. One of the most bizarre stories of the year took place in New Orleans. A lynch mob stormed the old parish prison and lynched 11 Italians. They had been found not guilty of the murder of the city's police chief, but apparently the mob didn't approve of the verdict. The world of sports was quite different in 1891 from our present occupation of that today. The first World Weightlifting Championship was held. Remember that, a good trivia question. You never know when you want to pull that out. Cy Young, the outstanding baseball pitcher for whom the Cy Young Award is awarded to the best pitcher of the year, the same Cy Young pitched his first game in 1891 in Cleveland. In the world of boxing, Peter Jackson and Jim Corbett fought to a draw in 61 rounds. Sounds a bit like the contest between Bernie and Hillary, doesn't it? First game of basketball was played in Springfield, Massachusetts, based on the rules created by James Naismith. But even there were 9 players on a side. I wish the Utah Jazz they could just bring 9 players out on the floor every now and again. Culturally, 1891 was a fascinating year. I'm guessing that many of our original founders were probably a bit more cosmopolitan than many of the others in Salt Lake at that time. And our founders may have thought of these openings of great value. 1, Carnegie Hall opened its doors, 1891, Tchaikovsky, the guest conductor. Ibsen's Hedda Gabler premiered in Oslo, 1891, which must have really knocked the socks off the people reading about that play in Salt Lake City. Hedda Gabler was a female lead character, the likes of whom had never been seen before on stage and possibly since. Hedda Gabler had a bit of a sexual past before marriage, and she was clearly bored in her marriage. Sigmund Freud, a decade later, would describe Hedda Gabler as the first neurotic female on stage. Maybe some of our forebears would have agreed, maybe not. 125 years later, we view Hedda as a prototype for the assertive feminist. Jules Massenet's opera Giselle premiered in Paris in 1891. Henry James's play The American opened in London, 1891. Oscar Wilde's play Duchess of Padua opened in New York. But literature, what may have those Unitarians 125 years ago been reading? Well, 1891 was the first year in which Arthur Conan Doyle published his long series of Sherlock Holmes mystery detective adventures. Herman Melville died in 1891, but he was still a popular read at that time, and so too was Émile Zola and Jules Verne and James Joyce. And although Emily Dickinson died 5 years before the founding of this church, she was loved as the great poet that she was. Our image of Salt Lake City at that time may tilt more to kind of ideas of the Wild West. But you know, 1891 proved a year of great sophistication as well. When we look at the global events and the cultural openings and the pursuit of newer and newer inventions, the transportation and communications, they were kind of in their infancy, but painting a scene today, I mean, these early inventions, we wondered, gee, how could we have fit in there? But still, it was a pivotal year, launching the auto industry and firmly entering into what we might call today the beginning of the modern era. Have something about 1891 when things really began to shift. Would a Unitarian church have been built were it not for those liberal idealists of 1891? Probably yes. Eventually it would have happened. But I think it would have occurred much later, well after Utah became a state in 1896, and the American Unitarian Association became more intentional about its growth. What was so wonderful, if not really delightful, is that our church began not through methodical planning by headquarters in Boston, but by way of an inspired speech delivered in this town, December 1890, by Samuel Atkins Elliott, the Unitarian minister from Denver. There was a sense, just right after his speech, that liberals in this city needed a liberal church community, and that they wanted a liberal church community, and they would commit themselves to building a liberal church community. And of course, they undoubtedly had dreams of what their little experiment might bring in the future. I believe we have done them proud. But now it's our turn to be the dreamers, because this liberal religious endeavor is far from complete. We are teetering on the brink of becoming a great church, a full-service church, a church that can provide real strength and value to an ever-growing liberal population. It's not the Wild West anymore. We're a great city that deserves a great Unitarian church, and that is up to us. Let's imagine what we can be, not 125 years from now, but 25 years from now. How might our 150th, our sesquicentennial celebration, how might that look in the year 2041? What might that be like? All I can say at this juncture is that Mary and I hope to be invited. Let's close our history lesson by singing hymn number 139, Wonders the World Shall Witness. 139. As we extinguish the chalice, may we have faith in life, enough faith in life to do wise planting, so that the generations to come may reap more abundantly than we. May we be bold in bringing to fruition the golden dream of human kinship and justice. May the fields of promise become fields of reality.